in the forgotten valley of Mabatha, where the sky burned red each dusk and the trees whispered secrets in winds scented with myrrh, a boy named Kifo was born crippled beneath the full moon, to a woman with silver eyes who died before she could hold him, leaving only the old grandmother Mama Jackie to raise him in a crumbling hut draped in charms and cowrie-laced curtains, hidden on the edge of a village that no longer believed in omens yet feared them all the same. And though Kifo's twisted legs never allowed him to walk like the other boys, his eyes dark, piercing, and ancient often saw things no child should see, spirits lingering in firelight and shadows moving against the rhythm of dusk. And on his 12th year, when the blood mango tree at the river bank wept sap that smelled of iron, Mama Jackie, who had grown colder and stronger with each passing year, led him to the secret room behind the altar, a room forbidden to the living, where a single object rested on black velvetan old wooden comb carved with screaming faces and strange adinkra symbols no longer spoken. A comb she claimed had been passed down for generations, but never explained why each daughter who touched it withered early, or why the women in their bloodline bore children who limped, stuttered, or lost their minds before 15. And as she pressed it into Kifo's hand and told him it was his now, something inside him cracked open like a calabash dropped on stone, releasing a wave of heat and a flicker of memory not his own, a battlefield of screaming women, a firestorm swallowing huts, a child screaming as an old woman laughed and combed her hair with that same cursed object. And in that moment, Kifo understood two things: that the comb was alive with something ancient and hungry, and that he was not merely crippled by fate, but preserved by it for a purpose darker than he could yet understand. That night, as the village drums echoed like distant thunder, and the moon bathed the land in a silver that seemed colder than usual, Kifo lay awake on his mat, the cursed comb clutched to his chest as though it were a child seeking warmth or a dagger waiting to be unsheathed. And as sleep overtook him, it was not the peaceful veil of rest that descended, but a pull deep, spiritual, and suffocating, dragging his consciousness into a realm unlike anything he had known. A place where ash fell like snow and trees bled thick sap that whispered names from the past. And there, seated on a throne of braided hair, was a woman with eyes black as charcoal and a mouth that did not move when she spoke. Yet her voice filled every crevice of his mind, telling him in a tongue older than language that the comb was not merely an heirloom, but a prison. And within its twisted wood lived the remnants of a queen sorceress named Nyoka, who had once ruled with beauty so terrible it shattered mirrors and youth, so endless it swallowed her daughters to keep it. And Mama Jackie, descendant of Nyoka's third born, had been feeding the comb in secret, offering drops of life from each child's soul until the comb could stir again, until it found a vessel worthy of cracking open the sea land now. Kifo, child of broken limbs but unbroken spirit, had awakened it fully by touching it without fear, by clutching it not as a curse, but as an inheritance. And suddenly the dream shattered into fire and teeth, and Kifo awoke screaming, drenched in sweat, the comb still in his hands and faintly glowing with symbols that now pulsed like a second heartbeat. And when he tried to cast it away, his fingers refused, gripped by an unseen force. And in the corner of the hut, Mama Jackie sat watching, her eyes glinting with a mixture of dread and triumph, whispering to herself in a forgotten dialect as she sprinkled ash around the doorway and pressed an obsidian bead against her throat, whispering, "He has been chosen." While outside the wind rose to a howl and the cattle cried out in terror, and all across the village, dogs barked and babies wailed, sensing something unnatural had been loosed beneath the soil, a power too long buried now waking with hunger, while Kifo rocked back and forth on his mat, trying to silence the voices flooding his skull, voices of ancestors, spirits, and something far more ancient that hissed his name not with malice, but with aching, desperate need. And as dawn crept over Mabatha, pale and unsure, the crippled boy's eyes had changed, one now holding a flicker of gold like trapped sunlight, the mark of one who had glimpsed beyond the veil and had not looked away. By the third day, the whispers never stopped. They hummed beneath the sound of insects, slithered through cracks in silence, and danced in the flicker of firelight. And though Kifo had not left the hut since the night of the vision, the village began to notice subtle shifts. The goats refused to graze near Mama Jackie's compound. Shadows stretched longer around her door, and the once limp-bodied boy was now seen sitting upright for hours without moving, his head tilted as though listening to something no one else could hear. And behind his eyes was a patience that unnerved even the elders, who remembered the old tales that were never meant to be remembered. But it was not until Bwana, the healer's son, dared to taunt Kifo by tossing a bone at his window that something unholy stirred. For the moment the bone hit the thatch, the air thickened, and Bwana's body stiffened mid-run. His limbs twisted inward like folding sticks, and he dropped to the earth, his mouth gaping silently as if caught mid-scream. His eyes rolled white like cowrie shells, and the villagers found him hours later still breathing but unable to speak, paralyzed with a look of horror that spread fear faster than fire through Mabatha. And when asked, Mama Jackie simply closed her door and smeared fresh charcoal symbols around her threshold, whispering old proverbs beneath her breath while feeding raw egg to the soil at Kifo's feet, who now neither ate nor slept but sat with the comb wrapped in bark cloth, rocking it like a newborn. And when night fell, the spirits came again, not as whispers but as shapes, crawling along the walls like painted smoke, chanting songs of the undying queen, who had waited centuries in silence, drawing power from every untimely death, every forgotten daughter. And now the veil between realms was thinning because the vessel was awake. And the curse required more than just lineage, it required loyalty, sacrifice, a pact spoken without words. And Kifo, with his crooked bones and haunted heart, was beginning to understand that he had been chosen not because he was weak, but because he had been spared from all things ordinary, shaped in silence to be the key. And when Mama Jackie entered the room that night and found him drawing symbols in his own blood on the hut walls, he looked up and whispered with a voice that sounded like many layered over one, "She stirs." And though her hands trembled, she nodded with tears in her eyes, because for the first time in 40 years, the ancient promise of Nyoka's return was no longer a myth but a breath, a heartbeat, a whisper away. In the days that followed, the entire village of Mabatha began to unravel under an invisible weight, as though the land itself held its breath, and the soil remembered an old injustice. Long-buried cattle gave birth to stillborn calves with glassy, human-like eyes. Elders woke from dreams drenched in sweat, swearing they saw a throne of bones rising in the river. And birds stopped singing each time Kifo opened his eyes, as if nature itself feared what he was becoming. For though his body remained twisted, his presence grew heavier, as if shadows bowed around him. And every night the whispers grew louder, not only for him but for Mama Jackie as well, who now spent her days grinding black stones into ash and placing it at every corner of the compound, murmuring rituals with trembling lips while glancing constantly at the comb, which now pulsed faintly in the dark like an unborn heart. And though she had once believed she controlled its power, she now realized too late that Kifo had become more than a vessel. He was an awakening, a slow resurrection, and deep within her, guilt twisted like a thorn because she had fed the curse with her silence for decades, sacrificing her sisters, her daughter, and perhaps now, her only grandson. And yet she could not stop what had already begun, for the mark had been passed. And Nyoka's spirit, though still trapped, had found a new language to speak through. Him, a language made of dreams and dread, of memory and command. And when the village chief, Eju, finally sent warriors to question the strange events near the edge of Mbatha, their leader, Omari, a man whose spear had felled lions, stood outside the hut and called out to Kifo, demanding answers. But what emerged from the doorway was not the boy they remembered, but a presence cloaked in wind, his hands raised and eyes glazed with a strange light. And before Omari could speak again, his spear turned to dust in his grip, his body kneeling without command, his voice stolen from his throat as he wept like a child before the crippled boy, who now carried the weight of generations on his back. And from the trees, the crows gathered in unnatural numbers, wings silent, eyes watching. As Kifo whispered, "The queen does not forget," and the villagers, watching from behind fences and fig trees, began to murmur of the old days, of a prophecy long dismissed, of a time when power walked not in kings but in children cursed and crowned by birth. And in the wind, something ancient stirred, drawn not by hate, but by hunger, a hunger not just for youth, but for return. Far beyond the borders of Mbatha, in the sacred highlands of Itundu, where elders spoke only in riddles, and the wind was believed to carry ancestral breath, the flame reader Nyarai stirred from a trance that had lasted 6 days and 6 nights, her skin damp with sweat, her white-painted eyelids fluttering open to reveal irises the color of storm clouds. And around her, her disciples trembled as she gasped for breath, and screamed a name not spoken in their land for centuries, Nyoka, before collapsing onto the ground, clutching her chest as if her heart had been clawed by the past. For in her visions she had seen the comb, blackened and cruel, breathing beneath the fingers of a boy whose legs were broken, but whose soul burned like an altar flame. And the vision had spoken of rising ash, of old bloodlines weeping in reverse, of a queen who once bartered eternity for the flesh of her descendants, and now sought a vessel to return not in body, but in will. And Nyarai knew then that the seal placed by the founding seers had fractured, not because the magic was fading, but because the blood that held it had been corrupted by ignorance and grief. And so, with urgency carved into every movement, she began to gather the forbidden items: a mask carved from termite-infested wood, a mirror wrapped in goatskin that reflected not what stood before it but what watched from behind, and a necklace made of 20 teeth, each taken from a seer who had dared peer into the spirit realm too long. And with these, she prepared to travel to Mbatha, her steps guided not by roads but by the tremble of leaves, the moan of trees, and the taste of copper that now lingered in the air. For the earth itself had begun to sour, and spirits once laid to rest were now waking in confusion, walking between realms, whispering of imbalance and betrayal. And as Nairai's caravan of silence moved through forests where no birds sang and rivers flowed backward, she spoke to the spirits beneath her breath, asking not for guidance but for time, for she knew she could not stop Nyoka, only delay her, bind her, return her to sleep before the vessel fully opened. But she feared she was already too late, because the flame had been lit in the boy, and once that fire learned to speak, it would summon not just the queen, but the age she once ruled, an era of blood and thrones woven from human hair. And across Mbatha, Kifo sat with the comb now braided into his locks, smiling at nothing as if listening to an old lullaby only he could remember. And behind his eyes danced the silhouettes of women in chains who were learning to sing again. By the time the sun rose over Mbatha again, its light felt thinner, as though filtered through dust from another world, and the trees no longer cast clear shadows, but instead birthed wavering shapes that seemed to move when no one watched. And inside the now desecrated hut of Mama Jackie, Kifo sat not as a child, but as a quiet force, his face expressionless, his legs still folded awkwardly beneath him but radiating a heat that cracked the floor beneath his mat, while above him, the comb swayed from a rope of human hair tied to the rafters, spinning slowly as if stirred by breathless winds from the other side. And Mama Jackie, once so certain of her rituals and her secrets, now sat silently at the threshold, her body bent with exhaustion, her fingers raw from grinding salt and drawing protective circles that never held for more than a few hours, for each time she carved a line of power into the earth, it faded with a hiss as if swallowed by a deeper force mocking her. And though she had once believed the curse would preserve her bloodline's strength through sacrifice, she now saw that it had mutated, grown hungry, and become something else, an intelligence awakening beneath layers of inherited sin. And in Kifo's presence, even she felt the weight of judgment pressing down, as though every lie she had ever spoken to protect him now returned as a chain around her throat. And that morning, as roosters crowed without voice and villagers gathered in hushed circles near the elder tree, a strange figure arrived cloaked in ochre robes, face hidden beneath a bone-white hood, the wind bending around her form as if afraid to touch her. And those who had lived long enough to remember old songs whispered her name in awe and fear. Nyarai, flame reader of the highlands, walker of dreams, last speaker of the tooth prophecies. And as she stepped into Mabatha, the ground itself shifted. The birds returned only to circle overhead without landing, and her voice, when she finally spoke, was like thunder pressed through silk as she demanded to see the boy who bore the comb, the boy who dreamed in the voice of Nyoka. And when they brought her to the hut, the air inside turned dense like the heart of a storm, and for a long moment, she and Kifo stared at each other, old soul to old soul, the boy with broken legs and golden eye, and the seer who had burned her youth for sight. And without touching him, she wept not for him, but for what she saw inside him, a flicker of Nyoka not just speaking through him, but growing within him like a seed watered by pain. And she said softly to Mama Jackie, "You have fed the queen, her womb, and now she blooms." And with that, she opened her satchel and poured sacred ash onto the ground, beginning a rite not meant for healing, but for binding. For within the boy's heart beat not only his own destiny, but the echo of a tyrant who once ruled the sky, and whose name the spirits had erased from trees and bone to protect the world from remembering. As Nyarai knelt upon the cracked earth floor and began to whisper the incantations, lost to all but the most ancient of flame readers, the air thickened until it was no longer breathable, and time inside the hut seemed to fold in on itself, past and present bleeding into one as flickering images of a long-dead kingdom emerged on the walls, visions of a palace carved from black coral, women bound in gold chains walking in silence beneath crimson moons, and Nyoka herself, regal and terrible, seated upon a throne made of the bones of her own daughters, combing her midnight hair with the very object that now hung above Kifo like a silent god, while the boy's eyes remained unblinking, his lips moving in tandem with Nairai's. Not in mimicry, but in shared knowledge, as if the words came from within him too. And outside, the villagers gathered, drawn by the unnatural stillness, watching as birds dropped from the sky mid-flight and flowers wilted despite the morning sun. And those who remembered the name Nyoka from forbidden tales buried their faces in their hands and wept, for they understood that something was being undone, that the laws of nature were no longer obeyed within the hut's threshold. And inside, Nairai's body began to tremble violently, her skin glowing faintly as the ancestral ash she'd scattered swirled into geometric patterns that hovered above the earth like living glyphs, each symbol resisting the boy's growing power, each chant like a dagger thrown into an unseen storm. And then suddenly, with a scream not her own, Kaifo's mouth opened wide and a voice burst forth, not a child's voice, not even a human voice, but a many-layered echo like thousands of women crying from underwater caves. And the hut's walls exploded outward in a rush of wind and fire, throwing Mama Jackie backward and lifting Nyarai into the air where her robes burned, but did not blacken. Her arms stretched outward like wings, and for a moment she hovered, eyes blazing, as if held by unseen hands, while Kifo floated opposite her, his crippled legs hanging limply, his entire body wrapped in strands of spectral hair that coiled around him like a cocoon. And at the center of his chest glowed the comb itself, no longer carved wood but solid gold veined with pulsing red light, alive, watching, remembering. And in that frozen moment, the wind carried a single word across the village: return. And all the trees bent toward the hut as if bowing in dread. And then, with a deafening silence, both bodies fell. Nyarai collapsed into unconsciousness, and Kifo lay motionless but breathing, the comb now embedded in his chest like a third heart. And from the distant hills, a rumble like thunder echoed, but there were no clouds in the sky, only a blood-colored bird circling overhead, screeching in a tongue not heard for 1,000 years. That night, as darkness fell with a silence so complete it drowned even the rustle of leaves and the buzz of insects, Mbatha became a village suspended between breath and burial, where fire refused to catch, where mirrors clouded with faces not belonging to those who looked into them, and where elders sat in circles whispering old rhymes that once kept spirits asleep. Yet even they knew their voices held no true power now, not against what had been awakened in the body of the boy whose very breath now whispered in languages that had no sound. And in the depths of the smoldering hut, Kifo stirred at last, not waking like a child from sleep, but rising as if called from beneath the soil. His body still frail, but his spine straighter, his head high, and his face calm with the knowing of one who had lived more lifetimes than could be counted on bones. And when he opened his mouth, not a word came, but wine cold, ancient, smelling of myrrh, dust, and dried blood spilled out and swept through the village, reaching every doorway, lifting the skirts of women, peeling bark from trees, and pressing on the chests of children like a warning or a welcome. And from that wind came visions that only a few could survive, images of a trial in a realm with no time, where a queen stood surrounded by daughters chained to her own spine, pleading to an invisible force that youth must be earned through inheritance, not time. And that memory, when stolen, was the fairest tax visions of Mama Jackie as a young girl, hair thick and strong, stumbling into that forbidden chamber beneath the ancestral tree, where the comb first called her name and showed her what her mother had done, and her mother before her, all bound by shame and greed and the belief that some beauty was too holy to fade. And now Kifo stood, not with hatred, but with purpose. And as he stepped out from the ruins, the comb embedded in his chest shimmered and pulsed like a jewel of divine origin, and his crippled legs, though still bent, carried him without pain, as if the earth bent itself to cradle each step. And Nyarai, leaning against her staff and coughing blood, approached him with tears in her eyes, and asked softly, "Do you know who you are?" And though he said nothing, a voice echoed from the trees, from the soil, from the wind. "He is the memory returned." And Mama Jackie fell to her knees, trembling, for she knew then that she had not merely passed on a curse, but given life to something far older, something that had waited with patience only the dead understood. And from the forest, creatures began to emerge, not beasts, but figures draped in the skins of forgotten tribes, eyes glowing with ancestral fire, neither alive nor dead but caught between, summoned by the blood song of the comb, now waking their long-buried queen. And they knelt not to Kifo, but to the force within him, and one among them, a tall, scarred woman with feathers braided into her scalp, raised her head and whispered, "The throne awaits," and Kifo, unblinking, turned his face toward the rising moon, as though he remembered when it was carved, under the full and swollen moon, whose pale light now cast shadows in the shape of things that no longer walked the earth. Kifo stood at the center of a gathering that blurred the line between the living and the dead, surrounded by spirit-summoned figures whose bodies shimmered like heat mirages, their skin covered in ritual scars and adorned with jewelry forged from bone. Their presence not of flesh but of memory, and as they moved, their footsteps made no sound, only the faint echo of ancestral drums long buried beneath Mbatha soil. And from the surrounding forest came more, dozens, hundreds, a silent procession of those bound to the queen by oath, by blood, by betrayal, and each one knelt as if called by a signal too deep for mortal ears to perceive. And when they did, the earth itself shivered and cracked gently beneath Kifo's feet, not in violence, but in reverence, as if even the land recognized its rightful heir. For the golden comb embedded in his chest had now grown tendrils delicate, root-like strands of glowing hair that threaded through his skin like veins, each pulse carrying not just blood but memory, each strand whispering stories to his bones. Names of women whose laughter had once filled the courts of Nyoka's kingdom, of songs that turned night into silk, of wars waged not with blades but with beauty and time. And Mama Jackie watched with hollow eyes, her heart aching as she realized that everything she had done, every child she had allowed to weaken or vanish, had not broken the curse, only cleared a path for it to walk again. And beside her, Nyarai wept softly, not from defeat, but from the burden of knowledge. For she now understood that what had returned was not evil, but balance and old force correcting the theft of time and legacy stolen by generations too afraid to let the past die. And then Kifo lifted his hand and the spirits rose in one motion like reeds swaying to an ancient wind. And from the forest edge came a sound like thunder, not in the sky but in the soul. A great white creature, shaped like a lion but scaled like a serpent, with eyes like dying stars, emerged from the dark, its massive body silent despite its size, its breath steaming the air with the scent of old tombs and long-burned incense. And upon its back sat a throne of woven hair and obsidian, untouched by dust or decay. And Kifo walked toward it not as a boy, but as one who had always belonged to it, and the creature bowed its head as he climbed, the comb in his chest humming in rhythm with the heartbeat of the beast beneath him. And the moment he sat, the wind turned direction, the stars above flickered, and the spirits around him began to chant not in words, but in a rhythmic vibration that made the trees weep sap and the soil bloom with black flowers. And from the mountain ranges far beyond Mbatha, a soft, shimmering glow lit the horizon, signaling the first opening of the gates of memory, where Nyoka's throne had once been hidden by time, and now stirred awake once more, as the mythical beast turned toward the rising light in the far mountains, carrying Kifo upon the obsidian throne that seemed to hum with the weight of lifetimes, and the ache of forgotten queens. The air across Mbatha changed again, not violently, but deeply, as if the village itself was being rewritten, its foundations whispering new roots into the earth. And those who had hidden in fear now stepped forward, not by choice but by pull, drawn to the boy who was no longer boy, the vessel who had become voice. the heir who had never asked for blood but had been born to carry it. And behind him, the spirits followed, now fully awakened, no longer shades or echoes but warriors of memory, their limbs glowing with ancestral fire, and their faces alight with a beauty that shimmered with sorrow. And Nyarai limped behind them all, her staff leaving a trail of charred symbols in the dust. And beside her walked Mama Jackie, silent and broken, her face hollowed by the realization that she had not passed down a curse, but given birth to a kingdom long denied its return. And as the beast crossed the eastern fields, lands once forbidden by the elders and long believed to be cursed, the soil opened, not in destruction but in welcome, revealing hidden paths paved with obsidian stones and lined with bones that sang low hymns of queens lost to betrayal. And above them, the stars burned brighter, constellations twisting into patterns unseen for centuries, as if the sky itself was trying to remember its own role in this forgotten history. And every creature, bird, beast, and spirit paused as Kifo passed, his eyes half-lidded, dreaming and awake at once, his body still frail but his presence immense. The comb in his chest now vibrating with a sound so low it could only be felt, not heard. And before them rose the first of the 3 ancestral gates, a colossal arch carved into the mountainside, guarded by 2 statues of braided women holding sickles made of moonlight and fire, their mouths open in a scream that never ceased. For they were bound to the threshold where Nyoka had been sealed, not by magic alone, but by memory. And now that memory had been restored, they wept molten tears as the boy approached. And suddenly the mountain itself groaned as if in mourning, and a light spread from the gate, not bright, but golden and deep, like the gleam of oil in darkness. And Kifo reached out his hand, and the statues bowed, their sickles melting into rivers of silver flame, and the gate opened without sound, revealing a staircase that spiraled downward into a void filled with stars and echoes. And from its depths came not a roar or chant, but a lullaby haunting, gentle, sung by thousands of voices in unison, calling their heir home, calling their queen's will back to the realm she had once ruled, not with tyranny, but with the terror of truth that no one dared remember. And as Kifo descended, the earth closed behind him like a mouth sealing a secret, and the stars above flickered violently as if warning the world that its time of forgetting had ended. Beneath the hollow mountain where time curled like smoke, and the stars above blinked, as though in mourning, Kifo descended the obsidian staircase that pulsed beneath his bare, twisted feet with a rhythm not unlike a heartbeat stretched across centuries, the steps echoing the forgotten cries of those sacrificed to silence, while the spectral lullaby woven from the 1,000 voices of Nyoka's chained daughters wrapped around his mind like a veil, not drowning his thoughts but drawing them inward, guiding his descent through a tunnel where walls of carved bone stretched infinitely downward and strange roots hung like braids from the ceiling, whispering half-names and dreams of lands no longer mapped. And as he went deeper, the comb in his chest grew hotter, more alive, its golden branches reaching across his ribs like a flowering vine of ancient hunger, threading his flesh with light and pain, and the sharp, bittersweet taste of memories, not his own memories of a throne forged in fire and hair, of Nyoka's laughter echoing across a battlefield where love was bartered for youth, and mercy was exiled from the tongue, and every step he took opened a window inside him where visions bloomed, women floating upside down in lakes of memory, queens kneeling to a child with no name, warriors surrendering their weapons to braided trees. And behind him the spirits marched without need for breath, carrying the weight of their own injustice. And Nyarai, despite her wounds, descended as well, leaning on her staff that now burned faintly with prophetic fire, her eyes dim but sharp, while Mama Jackie followed like a ghost caught in the memory of a mistake too great to speak aloud, her hands trembling as the walls seemed to whisper her name with every carved echo, accusing and grieving all at once. And as they reached the bottom, a circular chamber with no end, lit by a sky that pulsed from within the earth, they found themselves standing in the place of remembrance, a vast hall carved entirely of women's faces, each mouth open in mid-song, their eyes replaced with stones that glowed red when Kifo entered, and the floor beneath them changed, becoming liquid for a moment, swirling with the stories of those who had been erased. And from the center of this sacred pit rose a platform, spiraling like a strand of braided time, and at its peak hovered a sarcophagus wrapped in golden hair, locked with a single strand that pulsed in unison with Kifo's breath. And the comb in his chest began to beat like a second heart, louder, more urgently, drawing toward the floating tomb with a need so deep it defied language, and the spirits began to kneel, the room itself bowing as if the stones remembered the one who had once ruled not with cruelty, but with the clarity of ancestral law. And Kifo stepped forward, tears streaming down his face, though he did not know why, only that what he was about to do was both ending and beginning. And as he reached the sarcophagus, the strand unraveled and wrapped around his hand like a lover's touch, and the lid slid open not with sound but with breath, and inside lay Nyoka, not a corpse but a vision, eyes closed, lips gently parted, her hair spread like wings, her body untouched by time, as if she had simply stepped out of the world and waited to be remembered. And when her eyes opened, blacker than starless night, the chamber shook with the sound of every name ever lost being spoken all at once. And Kifo fell to his knees as she sat up, touched his face, and whispered a single word: a son. Beneath the hollow mountain where time curled like smoke, and the stars above blinked, as though in mourning, Kifo descended the obsidian staircase that pulsed beneath his bare, twisted feet with a rhythm not unlike a heartbeat stretched across centuries, the steps echoing the forgotten cries of those sacrificed to silence, while the spectral lullaby woven from the thousand voices of Nyoka's chained daughters wrapped around his mind like a veil, not drowning his thoughts but drawing them inward, guiding his descent through a tunnel where walls of carved bone stretched infinitely downward and strange roots hung like braids from the ceiling, whispering half-names and dreams of lands no longer mapped. And as he went deeper, the comb in his chest grew hotter, more alive, its golden branches reaching across his ribs like a flowering vine of ancient hunger, threading his flesh with light and pain, and the sharp, bittersweet taste of memories, not his own memories of a throne forged in fire and hair, of Nyoka's laughter echoing across a battlefield where love was bartered for youth, and mercy was exiled from the tongue, and every step he took opened a window inside him where visions bloomed, women floating upside down in lakes of memory, queens kneeling to a child with no name, warriors surrendering their weapons to braided trees, and behind him the spirits marched without need for breath, carrying the weight of their own injustice. And Nyarai, despite her wounds, descended as well, leaning on her staff that now burned faintly with prophetic fire, her eyes dim but sharp, while Mama Jackie followed like a ghost caught in the memory of a mistake too great to speak aloud, her hands trembling as the walls seemed to whisper her name with every carved echo, accusing and grieving all at once. And as they reached the bottom, a circular chamber with no end, lit by a sky that pulsed from within the earth, they found themselves standing in the place of remembrance, a vast hall carved entirely of women's faces, each mouth open in mid-song, their eyes replaced with stones that glowed red when Kifo entered, and the floor beneath them changed, becoming liquid for a moment, swirling with the stories of those who had been erased. and from the center of this sacred pit rose a platform, spiraling like a strand of braided time, and at its peak hovered a sarcophagus wrapped in golden hair, locked with a single strand that pulsed in unison with Kaifo's breath. And the comb in his chest began to beat like a second heart, louder, more urgently, drawing toward the floating tomb with a need so deep it defied language, and the spirits began to kneel, the room itself bowing as if the stones remembered the one who had once ruled not with cruelty, but with the clarity of ancestral law. And Kifo stepped forward, tears streaming down his face, though he did not know why, only that what he was about to do was both ending and beginning. And as he reached the sarcophagus, the strand unraveled and wrapped around his hand like a lover's touch, and the lid slid open not with sound but with breath, and inside lay Nyoka, not a corpse but a vision, eyes closed, lips gently parted, her hair spread like wings, her body untouched by time, as if she had simply stepped out of the world and waited to be remembered. And when her eyes opened, blacker than starless night, the chamber shook with the sound of every name ever lost being spoken all at once. And Kifo fell to his knees as she sat up, touched his face, and whispered a single word, son. And as the mountain screamed its golden cry into the heavens above, shattering clouds into fleeing flocks of ash-colored birds, and bending the sun's gaze toward the place of awakening, Kifo now Nyani, no longer crawling within the ruin of his limbs but standing with the fire of ancestors stitched into his marrow, felt the world expand around him like a drumskin stretched to the edge of sound, his breath sensing with the heartbeat of Nyoka, who now walked at his side not merely as his mother reborn but as a living archive of every forgotten truth, buried beneath centuries of silenced wombs. While behind them the spirits flooded upward, shedding their grief and reclaiming their names, walking barefoot over the golden veins now webbing the valley where once the cursed comb lay hidden. And as Nyani stepped into the light for the first time with legs lit by memory and voice charged with inheritance, the winds changed their direction, rushing toward him as though he were not man but storm, carrying with them the sense of distant fires, not of destruction, but of ritual. As across the widespread map of the ancient continent, from the lush emerald cliffs of the Kasimbo coast to the red-dusted bones of the Sula savanna, griots, fire-seers, bone charmers, and daughters of rivers felt the pulse rise in their temples and turned their faces toward the sky, whispering that the breath of return had begun for the land itself, forgotten and wounded by greed and curse, had remembered its own bones and summoned its true child to stitch the pieces together once more. And while the world stirred, Nyani was led by Nyoka through a path that no foot had touched in 1,000 seasons, an invisible thread of golden hair suspended between realms, weaving them through forests where trees bent to whisper names in wine tones, and stones wept at their passing, until they reached a forgotten village swallowed by vines and grief, where houses leaned like mourning elders and the well at the center bled black water that sang when touched. And here, Nyoka knelt and placed her palm to the earth, calling, not with voice but with blood, and from beneath the roots rose a figure wrapped in shadow leaf cloth and stitched silence, a spirit woman with skin like dusk and eyes like mirrors, her name unknown to all but the soil, but her presence enough to silence even the weeping wind. For she was Nemu, the keeper of wounds, guardian of broken promises and buried children, who had once sworn to protect the first comb before it fell into greedy hands. And as she stepped forward, she stared into Njani's soul and saw the fracture that had both crippled and crowned him, and nodded once before unraveling a bundle from her back that pulsed with darkness, revealing a mirror forged not of glass but of polished obsidian soaked in generations of mourning. And when Nyani gazed into it, He saw not his reflection, but the lineage of his blood-screaming queens, shackled girls, unborn twins, stolen sons, and at the heart of them all, the first grandmother, the one who had traded her soul for beauty and been swallowed by it, and her eyes were his, wide and filled with the ache of knowing, and Nyoka whispered that the mirror showed not what you are, but what your ancestors remember through you. And when Yanni reached to touch the glass, the mirror cracked not with destruction but with release, and the air round them turned to ash-laced petals, scattering the sorrows of the generations into the wind. And Nemu, weeping without tears, gifted Nyani a second comb, this one silver and cold, carved from the rib of a whale that had drowned itself rather than forget its child. And she said that while the golden comb awakens, the silver comb restores, and the heir must carry both, one in the chest and one in the hand, to braid truth into the world again. And as Nyani took it, the vines were seeded, the village breathed, and the soil beneath him began to glow with stories trying to remember their endings. And he understood that to restore what had been broken, he would have to walk through every memory not yet faced, bleed through every lie still spoken, and meet every monster wearing the face of a beloved. For only then would the comb's true power uncoil and remake the world not in vengeance, but in memory stitched with mercy. And when the skies ceased to be mere skies, and instead became a vast breathing body pulsing with ancestral rhythms, each heartbeat echoing with forgotten cries, each gust of wind laced with the whispers of names long buried beneath silence, Nyani no longer crippled, no longer a shadow of sorrow, but a vessel forged in pain, fire, and memory walked with Nyoka by his side, not as mother alone, but as blood shaper and truth carrier, into the valley of the first harm, a cursed land folded beneath the fabric of the living world where time dissolved into memory and memory fused with spirit, a place forbidden to those who had not tasted the bitterness of betrayal, nor heard the voices of unborn children humming through bone. And as they crossed the threshold marked by 3 thornless trees shaped like bent elders and a river that flowed upward into the sky, Nyani felt the 2 combs, one golden in his chest pulsing like a heartbeat, tied to the grief of generations, and the other silver in his hand, cold and firm as ancestral judgment began to vibrate with a frequency too deep for ears, too old for time. And he knew that what waited beyond was not just the source of the curse, but the womb that had birthed it. And when they stepped into the hollow center of the valley, the earth groaned and bloomed in shadows, revealing the ancient hut, its roof stitched from the hair of sacrificed daughters, its walls humming with the voices of women who had fed their life force into the wood to save children who were never born. And from the dark of its doorway emerged the first grandmother, not dead, not alive, but suspended in the breath between, her eyes like mirrors filled with other people's regrets, her body draped in cloth that changed color with every remembered sin. And as she stood before them, she raised a finger, long and cracked like the roots of an ancient tree, pointing not in accusation but in invitation. And Nyani stepped forward, the silver comb now glowing, its edges soft as moonlight and sharp as bone, and he offered it to her, expecting resistance, fury, perhaps a scream of denial. But instead, the grandmother wept not tears of sorrow, but of release, of truth remembered. For she too had once been a girl, scared, aged before her time, tricked by spirits who promised beauty if she would only sacrifice the youth of her descendants. And when she took the comb, the ground beneath them opened like a mouth, swallowing all 3, Nyani, Nyoka, and the grandmother, into the root world, a realm beneath time, where ancestral souls sat in circles made of firelight and silence, where drums beat not with hands but with heartbeat memories. And there Nyani was led before the council of unborn elders, Spirit beings neither male nor female, but shaped of wind, ash, and memory, who had waited for one pure enough to braid broken timelines together. And they spoke not in words but in rhythm, showing him visions of how the comb had once healed before it corrupted, how it had once been used to braid the breath of ancestors into the hair of newborns, passing power instead of stealing it, and how that sacred purpose had been twisted into vanity, greed, and generational theft when one woman, wounded by centuries of patriarchal ruin, chose to rewrite fate through sacrifice. And Gnani, hearing all this, did not respond with hate, but with the steady heartbeat of one who has learned that healing is not a return to what was, but a rewriting of what could be. And so he stood, holding the golden comb in his chest and the silver one now transformed into a strand of braided hair in his hand, and stepped into the ancestral fire, letting it consume him until his bones became story, his blood became ink, and his spirit became the thread through which the world could be stitched anew. And when the fire died, he emerged not as Gnani, not as cripple or prophet, but as the braid keeper, a myth made real, the first in 1,000 generations to carry both curse and cure. And as the root world faded and the valley reformed, breathing out the shadows and singing in colors never before seen, he stood alone for a moment beneath the sky, which was no longer one sky but many, each star a voice, each cloud a pulse of memory. And the grandmother, now reborn into silence, passed the final test. She bowed to him, her legacy no longer poison but possibility. And Nyoka placed her hand on Johnny's shoulder, whispering that the braid of destiny was complete, and the comb, now a unified being of light and sorrow, could be passed not as a weapon, but as a seed, to be planted in the minds of those willing to remember and to unlearn. And with that, Gnani walked toward the horizon where villages once cursed now lit bonfires of celebration, where children born limping danced on rivers, and women once silenced sang with throats of thunder. And as he walked, the earth whispered behind him, "He who was broken has become the braid," and the wind carried the tale to every corner of the land, where grandmothers wept and fathers knelt and spirits bowed, for the era of forgetting had ended, and in its place rose a new dawn carved, not from vengeance, but from memory rewritten through the body of one who once crawled and now remade the world with his very breath. And as the final drumbeat of night melted into the hush of dawn, and the fires in the valley flickered out like the final exhale of an ancestor ready to rest, Gnani stood upon the edge of the new world he had helped braid together, not as a cripple, not as a cursed child, not even as the braid keeper anymore, but as the silent echo of every story that had gone unheard. The vessel now emptied of burden yet full of memory, and around him, the villages that had once cowered in the shadows of generational rot now shimmered with light drawn from inside the earth itself, from ancestral blessings once buried beneath layers of silence and shame, rising like steam through the bones of elders who now walked freely through the marketplace, with eyes that remembered both the pain and the path forward, their songs finally unbroken, their stories flowing from tongue to tongue like rivers healed by the rain. And children who once feared their own bloodlines now danced in circles around trees newly grown, trees whose leaves whispered names that were once cursed but now sang of power reawakened, while Gnani, walking without limp, without staff, only the rhythm of breath and wind at his side, passed through village after village like a forgotten god who chose not to be worshipped, but understood, offering not miracles but memory, not spells but stories. As he approached the sacred hills of Orikuma where the final ritual must take place, the closing of the braid, the sealing of the tale, and behind him followed not people but the spirits of those freed, girls whose youth had been stolen by the comb, grandmothers whose beauty had faded into poison, sons who died young and without names, all rising from shadow into spirit song, glowing like flames made from truth, circling him with silence that pulsed louder than thunder. And when he reached the hilltop, where the red stones bled sap instead of water, and the air smelled of forgotten lullabies, he knelt beside the ancient drum carved from the heart of the first fallen baobab, and laid the gold and silver braid upon it, whispering not words but memories, letting each strand of the braid speak through the wind, one for every stolen child, one for every silenced woman, one for every man who had held power without understanding its weight. And as the strands dissolved into ash that rose like smoke, prayers, the sky above split into rivers of light and sound, unveiling the eyes of Orkuma to swirling vortexes in the heavens that blinked not with vision, but with judgment and grace, watching Ñani not as a god, not as a man, but as a bridge between eras. And from those eyes descended a rain not made of water but of ancestral syllables, falling like feathers onto the skin of every being alive, whispering into their bones the truth that all beauty born of theft would rot, but beauty braided from pain and patience would bloom forever. And Ñani, now soaked in spirit train, rose, with his chest glowing once more, not with curse this time, but with the legacy of healing, and behind him appeared the last figure he had not expected. His father, Aro, not the tyrant from before, but the humbled ghost of a man who had knelt before truth, in death, now wrapped in the bark of the talking tree, holding in his palms a seed made from his own regrets, which he offered to Ñani as reparation, and Ñani, accepting it, planted the seed at the base of the hill where the blood of the comb had first been shed centuries ago. And as his fingers pressed it into the soil, the ground trembled, the sky sang, and from the womb of the land burst forth the tree of rebraiding, whose roots spread not downward but outward, across the villages, the rivers, the ancestral lands, the forgotten tombs, carrying with them the message that the curse had ended not through war or revenge, but through one crippled boy's choice to transform pain into inheritance, to braid sorrow with purpose. And as the tree grew and bloomed with flowers that changed color with every story told beneath them, Ñani stepped into its hollow trunk, not to escape, but to become something else entirely. The spirit of future remembering, the wind that would rustle every mother's lullaby, the hum beneath every child's dream, and the braid he once carried now grew through the roots of the tree, entering the dreams of unborn children to tell them, "You are not broken, you are braided." And so the story of the comb did not vanish. It transformed, no longer a curse but a reminder, no longer a weapon but a mirror. And long after Johnny's body was forgotten, his footsteps remained, carved in the hills of Orkuma. And every year, on the night of the braided moon, families gathered beneath the sacred tree, combs held not in fear but in pride, to braid each other's hair, while elders whispered the legend of the crippled boy who walked into shadow and returned braided with light. And those who listened well could hear, between the wind and the stars, a single voice carried through the roots of the world, saying, "It ends where it began, not with a scream but a song, not with blood but with memory." And thus, in the land once torn by a cursed comb, peace grew braided through time itself.